They said the desert does not kill you all at once. It takes your shadow first, then your name, then it teaches you how to keep your hands steady when everything else is burning. Caleb Rowand's first clear memory was smoke and the shape of a man's back moving like a blade between flames. There was a small round stone in his palm, smooth from the river stones Ezekiel had tucked into the children's pockets for luck, and the heat on his face tasted like the iron of the harness. When the world tilted, the only thing that did not break was the way someone had taken hold of him. Ezekiel's gloved hand closed around Caleb's wrist and would not let go. After that day, La Cumbre was both shelter and definition. The ranch sat on a great sweep of the valley where wind wore the grass down to the color of old straw. Corrals, a long line of oaks, the house with its wide porches that hunched like an old man against the sun. These were the geography of Caleb's life. Ezekiel taught him to ride with a quiet that carried a kind of command. Ruth taught him steadiness by example, how to mend a shirt at the knee, how to set the table with the same attention as counting the day's receipts, and the land taught him patience. The boy who had once smelled smoke learned the business of distance, measuring it, calculating it, keeping his measure even when the heart thrashed inside his chest. By the time the ledger lined Caleb's long desk, he was more comfortable with ink than with speech. The pages of the ledger lived under the light of a lamp. They held the names of men who trusted him enough to ship their wool by his wagons, the amounts scribbled in a careful hand, letters from merchants in the city that promised payment by draft. The size of those pages and the sweep of his holdings, ranches contiguous to La Cumbre, leased pastures, wagons loaded each season with fleeces bound for market, made the word fortune reasonable in the mouths of people who counted land as currency. When sailors in the port town spoke of credit, they spoke in letters. Here at La Cumbre, they spoke in bales and in the steady fat ring that had formed at the base of Caleb's forearm from handling coin. He did not like the term millionaire. It felt too loud for the quiet way he carried his money, ledgers more than boasts, but the figures in his accounts and the breadth of his land did not lie. Lucia arrived on an evening the sky held the color of dry bone. Isabel, her mother, carried a small trunk banded with leather. They came from the south, from a town that sat closer to the river, where Isabel had once managed a small grocery and then fell ill and had come to La Cumbre seeking work. Ezekiel insisted the house take them in. Ruth said that a clean hearth could fix more than one kind of brokenness. The little trunk smelled of lavender and starch, and Lucia moved with the particular carefulness of someone unused to being seen. She carried no loud stories. She wore her hair braided down her back, had a face that learned quickly to hold itself neutral, neither asking nor inviting pity. The first thing Caleb noticed was the way she counted. Not only accounts and cups and measures for flour, but people. She would watch the hired hands as they passed through the yard, make a mental note of who lagged behind, who breathed heavy at sundown. She set the supply list straight and sorted the receipts into piles that made sense to her. Ezekiel praised her thrift quietly. Ruth made a place for her at the table. Lucia learned to read by the lamplight. Sitting with a battered Bible Ruth kept more for its weight and history than for its piety. She traced letters with a fingertip as if reading the land itself, finding the furrows between words like seams to be smoothed. When Caleb first saw her leafing through the ledger, the light caught the ridge of her knuckles and the concentration on her small mouth. She had the rare combination of a patient hand and a mind that noticed detail. Their days settled into a rhythm that left little space for flourish. Caleb rose before the sun to ride the perimeter, assess fences, speak with foremen. Lucia rose before the house had fully warmed, checked stores and students of accounts. They moved around each other with the ease of long habit. She would leave an account balanced on his desk. He would sign a draft and leave a half-smoked cigar in its ash. There were gestures of possession, his name carved into the underside of a chair in the parlor, a scarf Ruth set on the back of Lucia's chair, and other quieter possessions. He sent orders to neighboring ranches when the market looked soft. She organized the ledgers that tracked those orders. Between them, the machinery of La Cumbre kept moving. For a long time, that was enough. The world outside had a way of respecting the roles it had handed out. Men who had known Caleb since boyhood called him by less formal names only when the bottle loosened their tongues. Strangers called him Mr. Rowand with deference, and suppliers wrote to him using the same hand that signed promissory notes. La Cumbre fed people, both the body and the economy, and its master was a man who took as much pride in a fence mended on time as he did in the weight of a wool sail. If love existed in that measured life, it was the kind that grew like lichen on old stone, quiet, unnoticed until one tried to scrape it off and found the wall stained. Lucia's place, however, was not invisible. She possessed small lights that revealed themselves in how she handled the house staff, in the way she spoke to children who came by during market day, in how she refused, once, to let a young worker carry a heavier load than he should. The town fitted her into its story, the girl from the south who works at La Cumbre, but the story did not capture her will. When Isabel fell ill for a spell, Lucia took over care for her mother, with an economy of motion that kept the household running and the ledger closed. She did not sigh, did not court sympathy. She merely did what needed doing and kept her own counsel about what it cost her. Caleb watched these things the way one watches dust in a beam of light. He catalogued them. In meetings with merchants in the city, he described La Cumbre's yields with a man's arithmetic and mentioned, almost incidentally, that his housekeeper kept the books as neatly as any clerk. The merchants nodded. They were practical people. They liked efficiency. They liked the fact that the Rowand estate ran without frivolity. A good housekeeper, one wrote back, is worth her weight in coin. Caleb folded that note into his ledger and did not think of it again. The town of San Telmo, small and stubborn as a burr, paid close attention to intersections between households. It had a market day in early week where wagons jostled and gossip traveled with the same easy authority as the dust. People there made stories out of circumstance because the world made so few large surprises. They measured a person's life by the way they carried themselves in public, the tilt of a hat, the way a woman tucked a sleeve, the carriage of a child. Rumors began as light and, given time and the right wind, became storms. Veronica Hale arrived in a season when the sun hung soft and merciful, but the town's appetite for spectacle was as sharp as always. She came with a carriage whose leather had been oiled that morning, a woman who wore collars as if they were crowns. Veronica was the kind of beauty that had been taught its angles. She knew which look opened doors and which glance closed them. Her dresses were the color of river glass. Her gloves fit like a promise. She moved through the room of a dinner given at La Cumbre with the kind of ease that suggested practice. If gossip were currency, Veronica had made a small fortune. Caleb met her as a host meets a guest, cordial, efficient, with a child's distaste for small talk he could never fully swallow. Veronica talked about the market in the city, about a dance in the county square, about a niece who might come to stay for a spell. She mentioned, casually and with the precision of someone aiming at a mark, the importance of alliances through marriage. Her words struck like a line drawn along the map of the town's future. Lucia caught the same movement in the room from the other side of the table. She noticed how Veronica let her eyes fall once, deliberately, on the ledger that sat under Caleb's hand. There was a coolness in the smile that felt like a blade wrapped in silk. Where Ruth moved through the room as if smoothing a blanket over a restless child, Veronica moved as if testing the edges of possessions for weakness. Lucia watched her and felt the animal stir, a small tightening in her ribs that might have been jealousy, might have been protection. She did not offer herself as a shield then. She kept her place at the table, accepted Ruth's small offering of food, and folded her hands as if to keep them from trembling. Caleb noticed the way the town's attention shifted after Veronica's arrival. Men who had previously nodded to him in passing lingered. Women who traded gossip took a new interest in the Rowand house. Veronica's carriage came again and again, more visits masked as small social calls, until the town's talk acquired a new shape. Perhaps Mr. Rowand will make a match, they said in the market, as if the arrangement of two people could ever be as tidy as a ledger entry. Veronica's visits were as much performance as exchange, an elegant declaration that the Rowand fortune was available for alliance. It is a strange thing, the way a man measures himself by what others assume he wants. Caleb always believed himself guided by duty, to the land, to the accounts, to the people who worked his fields. He had learned to name his needs in the quietly practical language of provision. Yet there are predictions that live inside a man's chest and bend him in directions he does not foresee. The town began to line up expectations along the fence of his life as though he had set them there himself. For Lucia, the new focus felt like an animal scent marking the edges of the field. She saw more clearly the way Veronica left small, sharpened traces in conversation, an aside about companions that implied status, a compliment about La Cumbre's holdings that suggested ownership by association. Once after dinner, when the servants had cleared the platters and the lamplight had sunk low, Lucia crossed paths with Veronica in the hallway. Veronica touched the edge of Lucia's sleeve with a finger that left the faintest impression. "You do keep things in good order," Veronica said, her voice the sound of silk over wood. "It must be a relief to be useful in such an important house." Lucia did not answer the compliment the way a woman of her station might have been expected to, by making herself small or by laughing. Instead, she inclined her head politely, the way one acknowledges a stranger. There was a steadiness in her gaze that held Veronica off balance, like a fence post refusing a push. "You wear your usefulness well," Veronica added, with a smile that was almost affectionate. "Mr. Rowand is fortunate." Lucia's hands, still dusted faintly with flour, tightened around the hem of her apron for a single breath. In her mind she catalogued the small indignities she had carried, the way she had been grateful for a roof and for work, grateful until gratitude felt like debt. She wanted, fiercely and briefly, to tell Veronica that there are people who anchor houses without being asked to sign for them. She wanted to say that a ledger keeps numbers, but not the weight of a heart. Instead, she lowered her eyes and walked on. Caleb saw the exchange from the angle where hosts sometimes see more than participants. He'd learned to read other men's expressions as easily as the marks on a field. When he watched Veronica's fingers at Lucia's sleeve, there was no immediate anger, only a thin, precise note of attention registering. He had never liked Veronica's kind of light touch. It felt designed to move things into place, but he did not speak. He had been raised to measure his interventions. To step forward without cause could sometimes do more harm than good. Yet the town kept thinking aloud about futures as if they were only sums to be added. There were mentions in the church after Mass, and more at the post office, where women left the envelopes of their news with the same care they used to tuck away seeds. People began to say, with the certainty of those who trade in speculation, that a match between Caleb Rowand and Veronica Hale would secure both houses for the next generation. They did not see, or did not care to see, the small transactions of the household. Lucia's careful balancing of accounts, Ruth's quiet stewardship, Ezekiel's weathered hand on the reins. The town preferred large stories they could pass along at market day. It was a change in air more than a single event, an accumulation of glances, a pattern of courtesy folded into pressure. Caleb felt it as a pull on the ledger. Entries that used to be purely transactional took on potentialities. Veronica's visits came wrapped in the manner of things meant to be possessed. She spoke of social events and dances, and the way alliances could secure the Rowand name across a larger map. When she laughed, people leaned closer. When she smiled at Caleb, the room brightened in a way it had not for years. For Lucia, the effect was different. She watched the town align its expectations like a flock settling to sleep. She had been raised to read what people did more than what they said. She noticed the hours the carriage returned, the way the hired men edged conversations toward the kitchen when Veronica's visits were over. She began privately to inventory what she could lose. Isabel's illness skittered at the edges of her thoughts unpleasantly. What would happen if someone decided her usefulness better served elsewhere? It was not self-pity that moved her. It was a clear, cold assessment of risk. Agency, she had learned, often meant choosing where to stand rather than letting others decide for you. Caleb's life, measured and quiet, could have continued as it was for decades. The land, after all, teaches patience. But small towns like San Telmo carry a particular kind of heat. What happens within a few fences becomes the province of everyone who passes the gate. Veronica's presence was a slow light that revealed the town's appetite for design. It forced a tremor through the settled ledger of their days. Dinner with Veronica was all manners and glances and the soft clinking of silver. It concluded with polite goodbyes, with the carriage wheels sounding like punctuation on the road. The house returned to its familiar rhythms and the night to its measured dark. Nobody expected in those moments that a single sentence spoken in the wrong voice could unravel the delicate weave of their lives. The town had patience, it also had teeth. If you love slow-burn Western romances set in a world of land and ledger, consider subscribing. This story lives in the patient creak of porches and the slow turn of seasons. After that evening, The room seemed to remember Veronica's laughter for days. It echoed faintly in quiet corners. Men at the stable who had once exchanged only practical news began to ask each other about the latest visit as if it were a crop report. Women who begged for the church began to slip in thoughtful smirks when they passed La Cumbre's gate. In the market, a grocer mentioned, as he wrapped bread, that a certain family's connections could be useful. Nothing yet had been said aloud that could not be corrected by a deliberate gesture, an explanation, but sometimes a single gesture carries the weight of truth. A letter arrived a week later, sealed in a hand half-practiced on stationery. The letter was not from a man, but from a merchant in the city, confirming a shipment and requesting the Rowand house consider a new contract that would increase their roots. Caleb signed beneath it, as he always did, and left the letter where he had left many others, in a neat pile beneath the ink-stained lamp. The sweep of their holdings would grow. The Rowand name would be more visible in maps and ledgers, mentioned in itineraries. With growth comes attention. With attention comes decisions. Lucia watched him sign and recognized the small, sustained motion that was his answer to any problem. Ink, seal, signature. She knew that in his world, problems got smaller when they were written down. Yet there are matters no ledger can contain. The way someone looks at you across a table, the shape of speech meant to claim. When the idea of possible alignment between Caleb and Veronica seeped into the corners of the house, Lucia felt the distinct cold of being counted as an instrument rather than a person. She considered leaving, briefly, that notion settling like a thought not yet formed into resolve. Surely a woman with skills and the knowledge of accounts could find work elsewhere. There were other households, other ranches. Isabel's hands, though weakened by illness, still tugged at her skirt in those moments, and Ruth's quiet faith in her steadiness was a kind of tether. Leaving would be an act of survival and of abandonment, depending on whose life she weighed. Caleb, in his room a hallway away, slept fitfully those nights. He found himself waking to the same small, disquieting residue of attention, as if the town's expectations were a physical thing pressed against his chest. He had never married. The life of La Cumbre had required his full attention, and after Ezequiel and Ruth assumed the role of parents, their expectations leaned toward stewardship rather than heirs. Yet some part of him now resisted the implicit certainty of arrangements. He had always believed that choosing was an action that must have its reasons. He had also, beneath the ledger's rationality, the memory of being held in a man's arms when the world burned, and of the gratitude that had formed like iron in his ribs. Gratitude is an odd bedfellow. It can become a kind of duty so ingrained it pretends to be love. That possibility made his chest ache. When Veronica returned again, it was with a small bridle of talk and arrangements tucked like a fan into her sleeve. She made references to dances and to balls in the city, to social registers, and the way their names could be paired in announcements with advantage. She did not announce intentions, she suggested them. The town, eager to fill the spaces, answered for her without being asked. At dinner she spoke directly to Caleb about alliances, her voice lined with the practical language of beneficial unions. "It is only sensible," she said, "that houses like ours look forward. A match can secure many things for both families." Ruth, with her soft, steady eyes, merely lifted her teacup and smiled. Ezequiel watched the play of people with the same stillness he used to watch storms on the ridge. Caleb felt the words as if they were small hooks placed in the timber of his life. He answered with a civility that sounded to him like policy. "We must consider all offers," he said. "La Cumbre has responsibilities." Veronica's smile sharpened. Of course, one would only be foolish to pass up good sense. Lucia sat at the side, hands folded, as one might watch a field from a distance. She had learned to notice weather and to predict the way people's tempers changed with it. There was a presentiment in her that a seed had been planted, one that could grow into a rodent problem if not rooted out. That night, when the house settled and the hired men tuned out to their own affairs, she sat for a while with the ledger opened on her lap and considered the arithmetic of leaving. She thought of Isabel's fragile figure in the next room and of Ruth's plate cleared with the same gentle hands that had always wiped the table clean. Caleb, closing his ledger, felt the weight of a decision press against him. There was the practical, contracts, expansions, alliances, And there was another ledger entirely, one that counted debts of gratitude, obligations to those who had saved him, the unspoken promises made in small rooms when no one else listened. He had, for most of his life, converted feeling into duty. He feared the reverse, duty masquerading as feeling. He was not certain if what formed in the quiet between him and Lucia was gratitude turned to tenderness, or a new thing grown from regard and familiarity. The difference mattered. The town's appetite continued, and with appetite comes risk. A careless word in the market, an offhand comment at church, a letter mislaid. These were the sparks that could set rumor alight. For now there was only pressure, an accumulation of small things that shifted the shape of their days. Veronica's presence created a kind of tautness in the house. It revealed that even in a place built on steady labor, choices could be rushed. Opinions could be swift and damning, and the fence around a life could be pried open by men and women who specialized in reordering other people's fortunes. Still, La Cumbre endured in its routines. Mornings rose and fell, sheep still bleated in the fields, workers still mended fences. Ezekiel's hands, knobby and patterned with years of sun, continued to guide the reins of the ranch's work. Ruth prepared porridge and buttered rolls with care. Isabel sat by the window and mended when she could. The world did not revolve on the axis of social maneuvering alone, but such maneuvers were patient, and patience could be the most dangerous thing of all. One evening, when the sun dropped low and the air cooled enough to carry the scent of damp earth from the nearby arroyo, Veronica came again. This time she did not arrive in a large carriage, but in a smaller, more intimate conveyance. She stepped onto the porch with the careful grace of someone making an offer, and met Caleb's eyes with something like intent. There are looks that court the future as if it were a commodity. Veronica gave him one of those looks, and the porch seemed for a moment to contract. "Mr. Rowand," she said in a voice made for being heard, "there are certain advantages to knowing where one's future may lie." Caleb, who had spent a life learning to hold his responses, felt a familiar set of muscles go taut. He could have said nothing. He could have deflected. He could have introduced some distance and let the matter pass. He did not yet know that a single sentence, spoken in the wrong place, would soon be turned into a shield and a wound. Lucia watched from the doorway as the two of them spoke in measured phrases. She did not let the sight of their exchange shake her. She had been taught to anchor herself. But inside, beneath her measured exterior, something stirred. A determination that she would not be a prop in someone else's history. She had chosen to be at La Cumbre in her own small way. The thought of being moved along like a piece on a board made a faint but steady anger rise. The night closed on them with the unremarkable weight of ordinary things: dishes washed, boots set to dry, a lamp blown low on the porch. Nobody yet knew what shape the coming weeks would take. The town looked outward, waiting to shape the story. Inside the house, 3 people: the man who kept ledgers, the woman who kept the hearth, the woman who kept watch, kept their small certainties and their secret reckonings. A word spoken with the cool precision of Veronica Hale had lodged itself somewhere between them. It would prove to be the kind of thing that grows. Caleb lay awake later that night and thought of the stone he had held in his hand when the world burned. He felt it now as memory and as warning. Things that anchor can also be anchors that hold one back. He thought of gratitude, of duty, and of the strange way gratitude can feel like possession. He thought of Lucia, her hands, her steady way of setting accounts right, and realized, with the slow, unwanted clarity of someone suddenly able to read a page he'd glanced over for years, that there were lengths to which his measured life could be shorter than his heart. But revelation does not act on its own. It is a spark that needs air and kindling. Outside the house, the town whispered. Inside, plans were made in small ways: a guest list, a carriage scheduled, a letter folded and sent. The scales had not yet fallen. A single, carefully chosen sentence waited like a coin to be spent. The coin waited like a small accusation on Caleb's desk, only a line of ink on a paper, a decision not yet spent, but the town had begun to trade in things louder than ink. Rumor, once caught, travels in the bellies of women who fold bread and men who mend gates. It grows teeth the way a winter vine finds its hold. Veronica had not been idle. Her visits lengthened into expectable appearances. Her questions became implicit claims. People began to speak of futures as if they were objects to be apportioned. The night the rumor snapped into something like consequence, there was a dance in the county square, a charity evening for the mission that drew the county's polite faces under a canopy of lanterns. Such events were stitches in the town's social cloth. They were where alliances were embroidered by practice and where one misstep could unravel a seam. Veronica chose the night for a reason. She moved through the crowd like a fetched breeze, half flirtation, half declaration, leaving small ripples in her wake. She took the center of conversation. She laughed just loud enough to be heard. Caleb had not intended to go. He had set down his ledger to ride at dawn, and his mind had been full of fences and numbers. Yet news travels fast in San Telmo, and when a letter from a merchant arrived asking if he could be present at a modest reception, if only to lend weight to a contract negotiation, he found himself crossing the square in a sober coat and boots that had seen seasons enough. He watched Veronica from the edge of the light as one watches a storm from a veranda, with hands quiet, measuring. Lucia had declined the invitation. Ruth insisted she stay in the kitchen to help set things in place. The housekeeper's presence could not be permitted to wander when the town's women might need a plain hand for service. She smiled and accepted the duty, but she watched the lantern-lit night from the back windows, seeing the flicker of possibility like a moth caught to flame. She thought of the ledger left on Caleb's desk and of the way the town's appetite had sharpened. Her fingers closed around a towel as if it were a small protest against the world. Veronica did what she always did. She made performance and reality indistinguishable. At the edge of the dance, she arranged herself beside a man who had recently come into modest means, a town councilman's cousin who owned a pair of fields and an appetite for spectacle. They moved through a staged intimacy. Veronica, who had been practicing the small lines of flirtation, gave a look that meant both observe and claim. The plan, the gossip would later conclude, was to make Caleb jealous or to make the town see him as desiring what was already near. Whatever the calculation, the effect was immediate. A whisper reached the house. Ruth's eyes narrowed when she heard the rumble of wheels, when the murmur of voices turned threaded with a sharper tone. "Go," Ezekiel said to Caleb when he returned, practical as always. "Go see your company." Caleb hesitated only a fraction. When he walked across the square, he felt the town's attention like a braid of rope being wound around his chest. He found Veronica laughing, her hand on the councilman's arm, her head tipped just so. It was an ordinary tableau of flirtation and advantage. To the unpracticed eye it might have seemed like nothing more than the passing of an evening, but gestures meant something in a place that had little else to mark fate with. People read them like weather. When Caleb crossed the lantern light and stayed between Veronica and the councilman, she offered him a smile that carried the lightness of victory. "Mr. Rowand," she said, as if they were continuing an earlier conversation. "You came at last. I was beginning to fear you preferred the counting house to company." He answered with a measured civility. "The counting house keeps to its own hours." His eyes found Lucia in his mind where she had been that night, a small figure at the back of a room, tending to duty. He understood, in the way men understand the weight of what is visible to others, that Veronica's performance was meant to rearrange the public ledger. He stepped forward not to take a man's place, but to halt a story forming that could cost another woman more than embarrassment. "You know," he said, his voice steady so that the words cut clean against lantern light, "the woman who keeps my accounts is not in need of instruction on usefulness. She is, in fact, my—" His jaw tightened, and for a breath he could not choose the precise term. Public selection demands precision. Words are instruments. "My fiancé," he finished. The sentence landed with the sharpness of a thrown stone. Conversation stilled like a hand closing a gate. The two women at the next table began to whisper, and then stopped to let the sound settle. Veronica's face froze into an expression that was half surprise and half the calculated charm of someone whose plans were interrupted. Her gloves, perfectly stitched, flexed on her wrist. For a moment the square held its breath. Then the gossip began to reweave itself around the new shape. "Fiancé," someone muttered. "Well," another said, with the cautious relish of the market. "What an announcement!" Caleb did not wait for approval. In naming Lucia, he had bought a moment, a defensive shell, a public truth to short-circuit Veronica's design. He saw the effect instantly. Men who had been poised to speculate blinked and recalculated. Women with spoons poised for rumor closed their lips. Veronica's smile thinned into something like anger beneath silk. He had intended the name as an answer, a move to protect what he thought vulnerable. He had not intended, he would say later, that the name would change anyone's life beyond needing to close a loose end. Lucia that night learned what it is to be named. She felt the town's new rumor, as if it were a warmth on her back that might be either blessing or burn. When a servant whispered to her that Mr. Rowand had declared her his fiancé, she stood still and let the words pass through her like light through a glass. Her hands, that had been steady through counting and comforting, trembled a little as if a vibration had found its way up from the house floor. She had to measure what that naming meant. It could be a shield, and some shields have a weight men do not take into account. The next days were a blur of careful arrangements and quiet coercions. Veronica reacted as anyone would when their plan is overturned, with recrimination wrapped in civility, and then with open maneuvers meant to make the town see her as wronged. She planted stories that suggested an improper closeness between Caleb and herself to begin with. She suggested, with the soft precision of a well-aimed seed, that the declaration had been a mistake, a misunderstanding. Women at market spoke of the bad taste of scandal even as they flushed at the thrill of it. Caleb, who moved the land as others moved gears, sought a clean solution. There were practicalities to consider: the town's appetite for spectacle, the defense of the household's reputation, the careful footwork of neighbors who measured rows of barns by what they could count in advantage. Words had been given, they had to be backed by shape. A contract, even of paper, would carry a weight. It would be better, he decided, to formalize what he had once thought a mere expedient. Lucia heard the plans for marriage with the clarity of someone cataloging inventory. They spoke in the house about bouquets and a witness. Ruth handled linens as if she were balancing accounts. Isabel, though weak, worked a darning needle with slow assurance. Ezekiel made a face and said very little, the way men of his sort do in the face of things that require practical action more than words. He appointed a small group of witnesses, a minister from the mission, 2 neighbors, a clerk who had seen many such signatures. The ceremony would be brief, in the mission's small chapel, and private enough to blunt gossip. They would not have a feast that could inflame tongues. They would make something legal of the name. Lucia sat through the arrangements with a posture of someone who is watching the weather change across a distant field. She understood why Caleb had done what he did. She also understood what naming did to a woman's life. To be declared someone's fiancé in a town like San Telmo was to have doors open and shutters closed according to other people's decisions. She could resign herself to the life of housekeeper who had become mistress by declaration. She could accept security and the quiet ownership of a home. Or she could refuse, take her trunk, and find work that would not be owned by the conventions of an infatuated town. She had always chosen on the basis of survival and of calculation. Now she measured the cost of staying. When they were married, it was in a small ceremony under oil lamps and a minister's low voice. Caleb's ledger lay folded and kept like a private thing when he stepped forward and put his hand in Lucia's. The vows were brief, words clipped by the mission's custom. Ezekiel stood like a rock behind Caleb, Ruth's hands clasped in her lap, Isabel wiping her eyes with the hem of a handkerchief. The witnesses signed. The minister blessed the joining. The town's rumor turned into a legal fact. For the watchers, the wedding closed a chapter. Veronica retreated into her satin and launched veiled comments in parlors that had memory as weapon. The town settled into the new line in the ledgers: husband and wife, the Rowands. The household took on a new rhythm. Lucia assumed the title she had never asked for and carried it with the care she had given to every account she touched. She smiled at the neighbors and learned the small measures of a mistress in a house that had been her workplace. But names once spoken do not always tidy the heart's books. The wedding did not change the fact that the declaration had begun as a shield. It did not erase the way Lucia knew she had been chosen in defense of another's reputation, rather than for her own sake. In the weeks that followed the ceremony, a coldness settled into the bed the way frost sits on the lowest leaves. Caleb performed the duties of a husband with the same efficient, steady attention he gave fences and animals. He paid wages on time, signed letters and addresses, attended to contracts. He set fresh flowers in a jug on the table, but they looked like a ledger notation rather than the sudden warmth of a kept promise. Lucia moved through the house as she always had, but now with the added gravity of a title. She oversaw the staff and the accounts and attended to Isabel when the woman's cough worsened. She accepted callers with the kindness of someone who knew what was expected. She did not let on, to most people, the hunger that had grown between the lines. An ache that was less romantic and more of wanting to be chosen in the way one chooses a partner in the field, not merely a name in the ledger. The town watched them with the thin hope of those who prefer a tidy moral to life. Some welcomed the match, some continued to murmur. Veronica, thwarted, kept herself polished as a response. The councilman's cousin strolled through reflections of a public step, the memory of the lantern-lit night made new. All the while, La Cumbre continued to ship wool and send wagons across routes to the city. The wagons changed, but the weather of the house remained the same. Lucia found a slow gathering hardness in her chest that no 2-pound ledger could counter. She began to place the small things of her life into a trunk with the precision of someone who makes lists not for frivolity, but for survival. Each stitch of linen folded into the trunk was a quiet argument, a question signed and delivered without response. She placed a few books, Ruth's battered Bible, a small practical book on household management she had used to teach herself, and a ledger of her own, filled with entries about the household. She set aside Isabel's shawl last, feeling the tug of the woman's presence in the fabric like a plea. When Caleb found the trunk, it was because Ruth had told him with the kind of softness that makes truth bearable. "She's been packing bits, child. Isabel sleeps, but Lucia moves with paper in hand." He did not thunder. There are men who, upon learning a housemaid is packing, might bridle in anger or pride. Caleb moved with a different urgency, a ledger full of blank spaces, a calculation he had not learned to make. He found Lucia in the pantry, the lamplight catching at her jaw, the trunk open and half empty at her feet. "You're leaving," he said, and the words were without flourish, his way of testing a fact. She did not look at him immediately. She folded a sheet of linen and set it in the trunk, as if the act were an arithmetic that would prove something eventually. "I am leaving unless you tell me otherwise," she answered simply. "I will not be kept as an explanation for a man who named me in public to protect his own skin." Caleb heard the anger in her voice as if it were a bell striking a clear note. He felt, for the first time, the distance between the person he had needed and named and the woman who now stood like an inventory of what he had never allowed himself to call by a truer name. He had used a word in the square to stop the town's teeth from biting. He had not contemplated the cost of that word landing on another person like an anchor. "Stay," he said at last, and the plea was not for pride. It was as if someone had reached into his chest and found there the iron that had formed when Ezekiel had rescued him from smoke. "Stay and let me be more than what I've been." Lucia paused, finally turning to him. The light set the ledger's edge in soft relief against her fingers. There was a long history in her eyes of things accepted and refused. "Because you named me?" she asked. "Because the town needed a story to settle? Or because you have chosen me when no one watches?" Caleb swallowed. He had never been fond of speeches. He had, in his life, substituted action for words until he had convinced himself that action was enough. Now, with the trunk open between them, action required articulation. He thought of the stone in his child's hand, of Ezekiel's steady grasp, of Ruth's unremarkable kindness. He thought of the ledger's neat entries and of the way Lucia had straightened the margins of his house in ways he had not understood until they were missing. "I named you because I needed to stop a lie from being told about my house," he said, slow, each word like an effort. "I named you because—" He looked at the papers on his desk, at the ledgers that had been his language, and found them insufficient. "Because I could not bear to let anyone use you as a shield." Lucia's mouth tightened. "A shield still bears harms, Mr. Rowand. Shields are not people." He could have given the technicalities of his choices. He could have pointed to contracts and reputations. Instead, he stepped closer, the way a man approaches work, with measure and with intention. Up close, Lucia saw the small tremor in his hands, the same hands that signed his name to drafts, that had once closed around a child's wrist in smoke. Those hands now hovered over the trunk as if they were deciding whether to touch something precious. I am a man who is good at making things right on paper, he said. I know how to fix fences, how to keep the men fed, how to make sure wagons reach the city. I am not always good at naming what matters that cannot be written down. But I have watched you. I have watched you set accounts straight, carry Isabel through nights, teach a hired boy to read a line, mend a shirt where others would throw it away. He paused. I have been grateful to you for years. Gratitude is an ugly kind of debt. If that is all it is, then I will not bind you to it. If it is not, if what grows is something like love, then I will learn to say it properly. There was a tenderness in his voice that surprised them both. It was not the practiced civility used to keep gossip from festering. It was unvarnished and raw in a way he had not permitted himself before. He reached for her hand, not boldly, but as one might reach for a tool one has learned to use. His fingers met hers, and for a heartbeat, it seemed to both that the past and the possibility of future could be measured against the warmth in that palm. Lucia, who had been trained to count and to weigh, felt the impulse to test the fact. Speak plainly, she said. Do you mean you love me, Mr. Rowand? Or do you mean you will feel bad if I leave? He looked at the ledger of his life as if it were a map he had not finished drawing. I do not know how to say what I have been too slow to name, he admitted. I know this. When I named you in the square, it was a word meant to stop harm. But since then, watching you move through the house, the steadiness of your hands, the way you notice where the fences need mending in people's spirits, I have known that what I feel is not merely gratitude. It is the awareness that my life is less whole when you are not in it. He stopped because language with him always threatened to become a tool that might fail. I love you, Lucia, not out of duty, not out of convenience. I love you in that slow, practical way I know how to do things, by being present, by sharing responsibilities, by asking your counsel. I will learn to do better than this, if you let me. Her jaw set in a way that hid the tremor, and she placed her free hand on the trunk to steady herself. She had a life carved from choices, and from the work of keeping a household together. To accept love in the middle of scandal and duty required a kind of courage made of patience and a refusal to be small. She had not come to La Cumbre to be rescued. She had come to belong where her skills were valued. Words are easy, she said. Promises are what must be proved. He did not argue. He had spent a life making promises to fields and fences, and had learned, perhaps late, that promises are actions kept over season after season. Tell me what you would need, he said. Tell me what would make you believe me. Her list was quiet and fierce. She asked to be consulted in decisions that affected the household, not merely to be told what the outcome would be. She asked him to speak plainly in the face of Veronica and others who might still try to use their names as tokens. She asked that their marriage be something more than a public convenience and less about the town's appetite. She wanted to know he would not default to naming her when a problem presented itself. She wanted him to choose her because he had considered it fully and would hold to that choice, not because the town demanded a figurehead. Caleb listened and took a pen to an empty strip of paper like the man he was, one who wrote down agreements as if ink could bind a heart. He promised to include her in business decisions, to consult her on household matters, to refuse the old ease of hiding behind a public naming when the private work of affection and decision was required, to protect Isabel, and to care for Ruth and Ezekiel in a manner befitting the debts his life had accrued. He promised, too, to try, to live the love he claimed rather than rely on words alone. Lucia did not answer immediately. That was not a failure of trust, but a measured acceptance. She had measured enough to know that trust grows in the dirt of repeated seasons. Then she did something no one expected. She closed the trunk and slid the lid back into place. I will stay, she said quietly, for now, but I will stay only as myself. She met his eyes. You will not name me again and expect that to be enough. Caleb reached for her hand and this time did not hesitate. The touch was not a shield or a convention, it carried the weight of a considered choice. They stood there in the pantry, the lamplight steady, the house's ordinary sounds washing around them like a tide. Outside, Santelmo hummed the continual low conversation of a town that had found new material. Inside, a different, quieter story began to be written. The weeks that followed were not sudden conversions of feeling into ease. Love, when it emerges out of convenience and duty, must be cultivated as if it were a new plot of earth. Caleb made mistakes, old habits of reserve that had been carved by necessity. He defaulted once to speaking for the household and had to be reminded that Lucia's counsel was not a courtesy, but a right. He learned to ask about her day, rather than to assume he knew it because he had watched from a distance. He began to leave small things that showed attention: a pot of her favorite stew warmed and waiting on the table, a ledger footnote that bore her name as co-signer. Those acts were clumsy at first, then grew into the grace of mutually sustained effort. Lucia also made choices. She allowed herself to be included in business meetings with the foremen whose names were printed in Caleb's ledgers. She sat in the office at his side as he reconciled accounts, and her arithmetic mattered. Men who had assumed her place as only domestic took notice. They had to learn a new respect. She taught a young clerk how to record receipts with precision and how to consider the human labor behind each entry. She was not content to be only the woman who kept the books. She was a steward who demanded a voice. The town watched this less caressingly than Ruth hoped. Veronica, not content to be irrelevant, launched small campaigns of insinuation. She made a point of being seen at Saturday horse shows with a purse of new finery. She arranged for gossip to be kindled in corners. But the town's appetite for scandal grew thinner as it met the slow, stubborn fact of marriage turned into partnership. People adjust to new accounts when they see they cannot cash them for entertainment. Still, there were tests. One came in the person of a business dispute with a neighboring ranch over water rights, an argument that could have led to court and expense and public spectacle. Caleb sat with Lucia at his shoulder and the foreman at the long table, and together they navigated terms, exchanges of favor for pasture, and payment schedules that spared both parties ruin. The outcome was practical and fair. When the men walked away and the town began to speak less of drama and more of deals kept, the victory felt less like conquest and more like proof that the partnership Caleb had promised could work. Another test came in the arrival of a child from a traveling family who had no place but needed a night's shelter. Lucia convinced Caleb to take the child in for longer. She taught the boy to read and patched his trousers. When the father returned after a week with money to reimburse them, he wept at being able to pay nothing. The Rowand household, in a small act, had become something like a refuge. These everyday mercies, more than the dramatics of confession, convinced the town that a real union had grown. Even then, the town's memory is long, and its appetites not easily satisfied. Veronica tried one last humiliation. A letter sent to a parson suggesting impropriety about Lucia's past, a hint meant to unsettle the mission's trust. It was discovered. Ruth's hands, adept at unthreading fabric, had also learned to unpick small hints of trouble, and the letter's author was shamed. The public rebuke reversed the narrative for a time. It was Veronica, not Lucia, who had been playing with the town's moral ledger. The real test, however, came in private. There are moments when small injuries accumulate. A cold shoulder after a public slight, a missed promise left without apology, an old fear pressed upon by a new insecurity. Lucia, who had learned to shield herself, found fury rising in her when she believed Caleb had defaulted to his old habits, deciding a matter in the office without her counsel, then offering, with the casual politeness of habit, a solution that undermined her careful work. She retreated to the porch and stared at the road where dust gathered like memory. Ezequiel found her there and, without pretense, sat and smoked a pipe beside her. "You gave him a chance," he said, plain and true. "Watch to see if he's keeping it." "I am not sure he knows how," she said. "He keeps acting like our name is his ledger entry and not ours together." He exhaled smoke and named the obvious. "Men can learn. They learn by losing what they thought they could keep. Let him know the cost this time before the trunk opens again." Lucia had not come to La Cumbre to be saved. She had arrived to do the work she knew and to take up the place she needed. Yet to stand by a man who was changing required a patience that could only be earned. She wrote in her small ledger of private grievances not as a threat but as a reckoning. She wanted proof, not of grand gestures but of the steady practice of inclusion. Caleb learned, sometimes the way a man does under pressure, by the ache of almost losing. He found himself remembering the night he had first declared her fiancé, not because he had wanted to claim power, but because he had feared harm. He found himself unwilling to risk that hazard now that the hazard's shape had changed into the risk of losing her for lack of understanding. He made changes that were gradual and genuine, He began to include her name on certain drafts, to ask her opinions at meetings, to share the morning cup, and, more importantly, to stand against gossip in ways that signaled his commitment. The definitive moment came in the barn one lean winter afternoon when wind scraped across the valley like a knife and the sheep's breath cast vapor into cold air. Lucia had been at the market and returned with a ledger entry that meant a significant sale for La Cumbre, but also with an account of damage to one of the fields that required tough decisions. She found the foreman at the stable and spoke plainly, then walked into the barn where Caleb was measuring a length of rope against aging wood. He had the look of a man who had been thinking of something heavier than rope. He did not speak at first. He continued to work with hands that had known smoke and thickness and the particular method of handling things that required care. She watched him for a long time, the changes subtle, the way his eyes softened when he read, the way he left his posture open. She felt a tenderness stir at those small human adjustments. "You're going to be home late tonight," she said, practical as always, but with an undercurrent that asked more than information. He paused and laid the rope aside, wiping his hands with a cloth. "There's a meeting in the city at dawn," he answered, and the sound of his voice held something else, a readiness to be present for what he had promised. She closed the barn door behind her and leaned her shoulder against it, closing out the wind. The place smelled of hay and leather, and the faint sourness of animals. It was a smell that had steadied her for years. She thought about leaving once more, not from scar but from wanting to be chosen not only in crisis but in the boring, heavy days. She had wanted to be part of a partnership that honored both ledger and heart. When Caleb found her on the porch that night, she was sitting with a blanket over her knees and the winter air pinning the edges of her dress. In his hand, he held a small scrap of paper folded into 3. It was a note from the city confirming a new trade route, a proof that they were expanding their enterprise. He set it down beside her, and then, without preamble, took her hand. "I made a choice today," he said. "Not for the house only. I decided to bid on a new contract that will require us to trust someone else with the northern pastures. It is a risk. I asked for your opinion before I signed." She closed her fingers around his hand and felt the calluses there like old maps. "And?" she asked. "And I listened when you said the man we had in mind would be brash and likely to burn fences in a hurry," he said. "So I chose another. It will cost more at first, but maintain the land better. It was your counsel that changed the course, Lucia. I had to learn to seek it." She studied his face like one who reads a newly inked page. He was not boasting, he was accounting. He had made a small but real change and named it as such. It was sufficient because the weight of it was in the daily movement of choosing differently. "Then we see how the change pays," she said, and the humor in her voice was small but tangible. There came a season when the town had nearly forgotten the scandal that had started it all. Veronica had moved on to other parlor campaigns, though she would still occasionally stand at the fence and stare across at La Cumbre with a small hardness in her mouth. People returned to their work and their small pleasures. And then, one afternoon in late spring, life made a kind of proof that is not found in contract or account, but in a child's laugh. A little girl, a neighbor's, came running to the Rowand gate with scraped knees and a tale of a fall at the creek. Lucia took her in, washed her hands, bandaged the wound. Caleb, watching, felt an old sense of continuity uncoil inside him. He thought of the child he had been, of hands taking his own in smoke and lifting him out. The past had shaped him into a man of duty. Lucia was shaping him into someone who could accept being loved in return. The full proof came when they stood together in the market during Harvest Festival, not as a spectacle but as a quietly present couple. Children ran between their legs with ribbons. The town's talk grazed their heels. A merchant called Caleb by name, and then, seeing Lucia beside him, tipped his hat with a new politeness. No trumpet had sounded, no grand declaration made the earth open. Instead, the daily work, the shared meetings, the inclusion in decisions, the small protective acts, had shifted public opinion like wind changing the face of a field. Caleb began to let himself feel the thing he had named. He kissed her, in private and in ways that felt honest. The touch of a hand on the back of her neck in the kitchen, a forehead pressed to her temple in the dark after a long day. A quick, unshowy kiss at the edge of a corridor that was both apology and gratitude. The kisses were not fireworks, but the kind of steady, ordinary policy that builds a life. When the crisis that had always lurked in the town's appetite returned in the form of a rumor aimed at the household, the couple faced it together, and not as one who had been chosen publicly for convenience. A young man's accusation, meant to insinuate impropriety where none existed, was brought quietly to the fore. Instead of letting Ezekiel or Ruth alone bear the work of defense, Caleb and Lucia presented evidence and witnesses. They spoke together at the missions meeting and unfolded their ledger entries as proof of integrity. The town listened because the couple's unity had been shown in seasons of work, not in a single dramatic defense. The rumor fell away like a fever retreating when a wound is properly tended. Years passed, and seasons piled like ledger pages. Births, small funerals, harvests that were bountiful, and some that were lean. Isabel's illness declined slowly but with dignity, and the house learned to adjust without being consumed by sorrow. Ezekiel, whose hands had guided many storms, grew older and steadier in his presence. Ruth's cooking filled the house with the slow language of comfort. The household expanded in small ways. A new room added to the west side to accommodate a guest. A new clerk hired and taught by Lucia with patience. A new shipment of wool that made this year's invoice brighter than the last. Then, in the way life gives proofs where rhetoric fails, there came a child of their own, small and stubborn as spring grass, with Kaladin's dark hair and Lucia's long observant eyes. The child changed the ledger more than any contract. Late at night, Caleb would sit, with the baby asleep in its cot, and trace the tiny hand that had the same firmness as his own, the same small bent to the thumb that reminded him of his boyhood. He would sometimes find Ruth or Ezekiel at the window, smiling in the lamplight, and know that the house had become not only his ledger, but his home. The town that had once called it a scandal now had new things to talk about. The baby, the third shipment's success, the way the Rowand horses carried their riders with surety. There were still whispers. Veronica still had her admirers, and the past's teeth were never entirely dull. But the central fact had shifted. The marriage had begun as a protective measure. It had become a deliberate choice that grew truer as time wore on. There came a day, years from the first declaration in the square, when Caleb wanted to be even clearer. He had learned to name things with intention. He had learned to sign papers that bound him to actions. He arranged, privately and with no fanfare, for them to stand again under the mission's modest eaves, this time to make vows not out of need, but out of choice. Lucia's eyes shone with cautious delight when he told her. "We will ask the minister to witness what is already true," he said simply. The ceremony was not intended for spectacle. It was for them, and for the few who had found their way to a steadiness that matched the land. Ezekiel stood with a hand on Caleb's shoulder, and Ruth's eyes smiled like soft weather. Isabel, frailer now, was present and wrapped in a shawl that Lucia had mended with careful fingers. The minister spoke of vows as the binding of intention, and this time the words carried not the weight of a shield, but the weight of a deliberate, chosen future. Caleb, in front of the small assembly, spoke without the exactitude of a man who calculates in ink. He spoke with a voice that had been forged by the barn and the fire and the long, slow reckonings of a man who had learned to measure his heart. "I married once to answer a crisis," he said. "I stayed because I came to know a woman's worth beyond what I had given her the right to be. Today I choose to make that staying a deliberate vow. Lucia, would you marry me, now knowing you were never a convenience and always a chosen partner?" Lucia's answer was not a trembling yes. It was a measured acceptance, a recognition of what they had built, and a refusal of the past's cheapness. "I will," she said, "but this time I ask for voice, for partnership, for equality in the work of our lives." They exchanged vows in which he promised presence and inclusion, and she promised patience and honesty, not as obligation but as gift. The congregation laughed and wept in small, practical ways. Not hysteria, but the tenderness of a town that had watched the labor of a couple become a thing that mattered to its communal life. Years later, the road leading into San Telmo still gathered dust in the same patient way it had when Caleb was a child. The porch of La Cumbre had been repaired and painted by hands now calloused with different work. The ledgers stacked on Caleb's desk bore more signatures now, partners and neighbors and men who had learned to trust a household that kept its promises. The wagons that carried wool had newer axles and a younger teamster who had learned his trade at La Cumbre. The house had become the sum of shared decisions, small mercies, and the slow accumulation of proof. On a bright morning, when the wind leaned like an old friend across the valley, Caleb and Lucia walked together down the main street of San Telmo. People stopped their chores and tipped hats. Children ran out to fetch small wildflowers and offered them like tributes. They walked hand in hand, not for show, but because it had become easy to do so. Lucia's braid, now dusted with a few silver threads, swung against her back with the endless small motion of life lived together. Caleb's forearm, marked with the old ring of coinwork, rested against her, their fingers entwined like the threads of a well-wrought blanket. They paused where, years before, he had declared her his fiancée in a moment meant to protect, and which had, impossibly, turned into a true life. The square, with its benches and the old oak that had shaded many councils, held the echoes of laughter and gossip and small dramas. A child recognized them and ran to ask about the baby calf the Rowands had purchased last month. They answered in the easy, practical way of people who share a life. Caleb reached down and picked up a smooth stone from the dust, one similar to the one he had held as a boy in smoke, and he tucked it into his palm. It was not a relic of trauma now, but a small object that had watched him learn. He gave it to Lucia, placing it in her hand as if offering a small history. "For memory," he said, with the quiet humor that had grown into him. "For when the wind is cold." She smiled and slipped the stone into the pocket of her apron. "For when you are stubborn," she replied, "so I may have proof you have softened." They laughed, not loudly, but enough that those who listened felt the warmth of a life remade. The town, with its long appetite for story, would still have gossip to spare, but the rumor that had once sought to define them had been worn down by seasons of work, by children and contracts, and nights of bread and quiet. What had been a lie turned into the instrument that revealed what two deliberate people could do when they chose each other. Years later, when the barn's beams creaked with the same regularity and the fields shone like a spread of old gold, the minister who had married them the second time would say, with his usual matter-of-fact warmth, that love was not merely the thunderclap of a first glance, but the habitual choosing to stand with someone through the ledger of daily life. Caleb and Lucia, seated at the table with children at their knees and Ruth humming in the kitchen, would nod. They had been given a nickname in the town, a joke at first that had softened into an odd compliment. The millionaire cowboy that everyone had once muttered about with a mixture of awe and envy. Caleb never liked the phrase. It sounded too loud for a man who had been raised to count in ink. But if one could reconcile terms, he would allow it as a testament not to the sound of coin, but to the breadth of land and responsibility that had placed him in a position to choose as he had. Money had been the instrument that stirred the town, but it had never been the reason he came to love. In the evening, with the lamplight low and the sound of wind on the plains like a chorus that had learned to harmonize with their days, Caleb and Lucia would sit on the porch and remember the small stone and the smoke, and the man who had taken Caleb's wrist and pulled him from harm. They would speak little, because they had learned that words sometimes only clutter the clear fact of life. Instead, they would watch the dust settle on the road where they had once been dragged through rumor and into truth. The town's appetite for spectacle had been fed, but what fed them more reliably was the sight of two people who chose one another day after day. Not because of a dramatic proclamation in a square, but because they paid attention to what it takes to keep a life from unraveling. Lucia had not been a prop in a man's story. She had become, by force of her intelligence and choice, a co-author of their shared future. Caleb's biggest mistake, the thought that naming her casually would be the end of the problem, had become the moment that forced him to learn to choose properly. They had begun with a lie meant to save reputations, and they had built, out of the rubble of gossip and the steady labor of life, a real union. It had not been inevitable. It had been, like the land, patient and demanding, taking as much as it gave. In time, the story that began with a fake wife ended in honest vows, with a town that no longer measured their lives only by the terms of conversation, but by the practical, quiet proof of a life sustained. If you loved this slow-burn Western tale, consider watching more stories where patience and choice remake lives. There are more on the playlist.